is Wetpixel Live. My name is Adam Hanlon. I'm the editor of Wetpixel, and I'd like to thank CCAM very much for sponsoring this episode. CCAM produce a wide range of housings, ports, strobes, and other accessories. And please head on over to ccam.com to see what they do and to find out more about their range. A question that was asked recently, and it's a very valid one, revolves around this idea of what is good light, what is excellent light. And I'm aware that as underwater image makers, when we're discussing strobes, when we're discussing the way we use lighting underwater, one of the frequent comments that we make is that we're looking for good light, and ultimately, obviously, all photography, all videography revolves around capturing light. So I guess it is a fundamental building block, but it is equally quite hard to actually define what constitutes good light. So I think it's a very valid question, and one that I'll try and explore in this episode a bit, just trying to put some flesh on the bones of what constitutes good light, or what I think constitutes good light. And I'm very aware that others may disagree with me, or may have other criteria that they use to gauge the quality of the light that they're using for their imaging. I think the first point about pleasing light underwater is that in general, if the light is pleasing, we tend not to be very aware of it. And what I mean by this is that if you're using a strobe or a video light that is producing a very harsh beam, that harsh beam becomes very obvious within the image, and it for me anyway, it draws my eye to that beam. Whereas if we're using a more soft diffuse light, a light that wraps around our subject as opposed to bouncing off it and glaring back at it, that tends to be something we actually don't even notice. So possibly the first point about good lighting, and the effects of good lighting is that it is very subtle. It's not something that we can necessarily see, and we probably will look at an image and think that's a great image, and possibly not realize that part of the reason why it's a great image is because the lighting's good. So it's almost a chicken or the egg thing. So it's to some extent really good lighting. Possibly one criteria we could start to introduce is that you don't really see it in the image. You don't really appreciate it. I think something else that we should bear in mind is that what constitutes great light will mean different things within different types of image, and very broadly, and I'm aware there's lots of subdivisions within this. Obviously, what constitutes good light in wide angle imaging may well be very different from what constitutes good light in macro imaging. And I would say, even given what I've just said, there may be creative examples where actually the light is obvious in macro shooting particularly, and is used to great effect. Obviously those images that have used a snoot, for example, to provide a beam of light onto a subject, and the beam is visible in the image, can have a great creative impact. So it's not as simple as saying, well, great lighting is you don't see it, because that's not always true. And particularly when we discuss the difference between wide angle and macro, obviously two extremes, and then everything else fills in between the two, then the way we light things and the way we choose to use that light will vary. So it gets really quite complicated. So I thought I'm going to start off talking about wide angle underwater photography. I think to some extent the benefits of great lighting are probably more obvious in wide angle imagery. And I think oftentimes, when we're talking about great lighting and wide angle, we all pretty much know what it is, because we can look at an image and think that's a beautiful colors, beautiful imagery, beautifully lit image. And the issue isn't so much what is great light, it's how do we achieve great light. So what can we do in wide angle imagery to help us to achieve great imagery? One of the temptations, possibly one of the things that's happened in the past, certainly with some strobe manufacturers, is there's been a great desire to show an increase in power in the strobe. So that's physical amount of light the strobe puts out. And one of the ways we can do that is essentially by overdriving the flash tube. Now, all strobes have, broadly speaking, a battery that powers a capacitor. This capacitor increases the current of the battery, and then it's discharged through a tube, which is what creates the flash. Now, one way you can increase the power of your strobe, of course, is by essentially driving that tube harder, by providing a bigger current to the tube, which will obviously make the tube flash brighter. Unfortunately, that often results in quite a harsh effect because you're creating a very kind of intense beam of light. And that intense beam of light obviously is passed through a reflector, which ends up appearing on the subject. So the first point is, generally overdriving strobes, pushing strobes. If you have all your strobes turned up to 11 all the time, you're going to end up with harsh lighting. That's almost inevitable. Something else that can affect the quality of light that strobes put out is actually a construction detail on strobes. And again, I'm sticking with the wide angle theme here a bit. Essentially, all strobes put out a cone-shaped beam of light. Obviously, as the light moves away from the strobe, it expands and increases in roughly a cone shape. Now, all strobes have reflectors that help this to occur, but the shape of the tube that's used to create the flash can also help produce an even, smooth image. So this strobe, as you can see, has a round flash tube. You can see it inside here. This round flash tube, obviously it's round, it's producing a conical beam of light. So the actual shape of the tube is helping it to achieve an even spread of light around that cone. Another example here, smaller strobe, again, same thing, round flash tube produces a more rounded beam. And again, these are obviously one way that you can help to achieve that even soft lighting that helps to improve the look of your wide angle images. Now, people are going to say, what about using diffusers? And certainly diffusers can help to soften and diffuse your beam. There's no doubt about it. That's what a diffuser does. Obviously, it reduces the power of the strobe, which may or may not be a good thing depending on the strobe, but equally it will help soften, diffuse it, but it actually still can't completely. If you have one part of the beam that is hotter, that is brighter than other parts of the strobe's beam, even within a diffuser, it will soften that, but you will still have that effect. Whereas if you've got a completely even beam coming out of the strobe and then passing through a diffuser, it will further soften and you won't get that hot spot, for want of a better word, or that bright area within the strobe. So although diffusers can help with strobes that have specific hotspots, then obviously the help will be limited compared to using a diffuser on a strobe that doesn't have those hotspots. So similarly, strobe manufacturers use all sorts of clever tools. Sometimes when they're using, they often will use either a straight or a T-shaped flash tubes, and again they use diffusers integrated into the actual strobe itself, which help to diffuse the beam. And again, they're clever with the way they use reflectors. So it's not fair to say that you must have a round flash tube strobe in order to get pleasing light. That's simply not true. But it does often help, and certainly people that are experiencing problems with their lighting, it can often be down to looking at the actual strobe that they're using to try and maximize opportunities. Color of light is important, and I know everyone's going to jump out and say, well, actually you can correct it in post. You can do stuff within Lightroom or your raw editor to correct any particular funky casts of light that you get. But saying that, in general, whenever you correct light within post-processing, it inevitably is almost always a global shift. So when you correct color temperature, you're correcting the color temperature throughout the image. So if you've got a strobe that's providing a very cool light, 5,600 degrees K, for example, or even 6,000 degrees K, then when you click on the eyedropper to warm that up, the whole color spectrum moves towards the warmer end. Now, that may or may not be pleasing, but by definition, it means those parts of the image that probably do want to be a bit cool are now not cool. They're warmed up. And so, although you can, of course, globally color correct, there is a compromise in doing so. And I'm not sure we as photographers should rely on that as a determining principle in terms of quality of light. We're better off getting those colors right in camera when we capture the image. And There again, there are tools we can do to use this. And Alex and I discussed the diffusers that we can use to warm up cool strobes, or using gels. There's lots of options we can use here. We can use in-camera settings, so white balance settings within the camera, to help improve the color temperatures of lights that we're using. So there is lots of options, but it's certainly something to consider. And I think pleasing light, when we talk about pleasing light, that probably means light that has an acceptable or a color value that reflects the best parts of the image, and isn't detracts from other parts. I mean, certainly personally, when I see white water, i.e. water that the color balance has been used and it's shifted everything away from the blues in the water, for me that would be an example of light that I don't think is particularly working particularly well. And I should emphasize again, it's a personal decision. I'm not critical of people that choose to do that in their own creative style. That's of course their decision. Um, So, when we're talking about wide angle strobes, just to recap, what we really want is we want an even soft light that wraps around the subjects and helps to create an image, and one in that we typically wouldn't see the lights. We see the lights effects, but we don't see the lights themselves. We don't see the effect of the strobe of the video light. So we don't see the light from the strobe of the video light, but we see its effects. Moving on briefly towards macro. Macro, obviously, we have all sorts of tools which kind of almost, to some extent, are the opposite. So things like snoots, obviously these provide a very, very direct beam of light, and reduce the amount of light. And again, we are controlling the lighting, but I guess to some extent, particularly with things like snoots, we're quite often using them to achieve almost a spotlight effect. Where we may have a very dark background and just a beam of light striking the subject, and that's to draw attention to it. And it's a creative tool. It helps obviously remove the background, and so it's a very different use of light. And pleasing quality of light, particularly when we're shooting a macro, is a different set of criteria, and important to stress that. I think that in general, we can get away with smaller strobes that basically produce a harsher light when we're shooting macro, because again, we're not trying to blend into a diffuse background typically. We're often trying to emphasize the effect of the light, so our criteria change. And certainly I think there is a lot to be said that the physical size of the strobe or video light has a much greater bearing when we're shooting macro than it does when we're shooting wide angle. In wide angle, we can certainly cope with big strobes at the end of our strobe arms because we've got plenty of room to move them around. We don't particularly or rarely want to bring the strobe right in against the port because we've often got a big dome port or a big water contact lens as well. So it's rare that the strobes are all the way in. Whereas macro, frequently we do want to do that, and this is certainly a realm where small strobes and being able to physically place them around the macro port close in, certainly is a criteria that I would say is as important probably as the quality of light that the strobe itself produces. So certainly I guess what I'm saying here is that no one strobe is going to do it all, and I'm encouraging everyone to go out and buy 2 sets of strobes, which of course I appreciate is not likely, but certainly it's worth considering. I think if you're planning to shoot the majority of your work macro, then choose a strobe that's going to be particularly good for macro, or alternatively, if your particular passion is wide angle imagery, then you want to choose your strobes based on that. And as I say, if you're in the lucky position to be able to afford both, look for different criteria in both, and be prepared to use different strobes for different things. So I think the last point, and certainly the question that I saw was answered quite well by Pete Atkinson. And essentially, when we're looking at daylight, on a bright sunny day somewhere sunny and hot, we describe the light as being harsh. It kind of hurts our eyes. It doesn't burn our eyes, obviously, but the effect on our eyes is harsh. And I think that would be an example photographically where we would certainly describe that as being harsh light. And interestingly enough, wildlife photographers on the top side invariably shoot early in the morning and late at night when that harsh light isn't really there. Occasionally, creatively, they might choose to shoot with harsh light, but in general, their most productive times are when the light, early morning, late evening, when the sun is setting and it's lost that power, and it's a softer light that doesn't hurt the eyes. It's a more enveloping, softer light. Pete describes, and I thought it was a good thing, this harshness that's created. The shadows are all straight lines and so on and so forth. And he described, imagine looking at the sun through a blanket or through a sheet, and obviously the light would come through that and would soften and diffuse shadows, soften and diffuse whatever you're looking at on the other side of the sheet. And I think that's, in fact, holding up the sheet and looking at the sun. Obviously, you now can see the sun, but it's softened. I think that again is a good way of looking at probably how we want to try and light, particularly wide-angle scenes, in order to create that soft, enveloping light. So, I think this is probably a bit of a ramble, really. I'm not sure I'm going to answer any questions with it, but hopefully it's given some ideas, and maybe we'll provide a seed for some discussion, and we can be more definitive about what constitutes good light, what constitutes good light quality when we're taking pictures underwater. I'm sure that not everyone will agree with me, and I'm very happy to engage in discussion, either on the Wetpixel forums or via another medium, or in the comments on below the video. Possibly is another easy channel to access. But certainly, I think a discussion about what constitutes quality of light or what constitutes quality light is a really interesting one to have. I think my final thoughts are that, first of all, you probably know what quality light is almost intrinsically, almost instinctively. When you look at an image and it looks pleasing, you're probably experiencing good quality light. And I think the issue often isn't so much about what it is, it's possibly more about how we achieve it. And hopefully I've given a few ideas on what we can do to try and maximize the quality of light in our images. So thank you very much to all of you for watching. I'd like to thank CCAM again for sponsoring this episode. We can't produce these episodes, I can't produce these episodes without their support, so it's much appreciated. As I mentioned, please feel free to add comments or suggestions in the comment section or on the Wetpixel forum. This video will be cross-posted onto there as well, so feel free. I hope it forms the basis of the discussion, and drop us a like if you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you again soon.